and those joining us on our Facebook live stream as well. We're glad you're joining in also. This morning is one of those stories that's relatively familiar. We've heard, if not all the specific details, we've heard the general idea that Moses parts the Red Sea and the Hebrew slaves, newly freed slaves, go cruising through there. An unwilling but obedient Moses has taken Pharaoh to task for having kept the Hebrew people slaves in Egypt for over 400 years. He goes to Pharaoh and petitions Pharaoh to let my people go. Now, Pharaoh is not loving this idea a lot. He's got a free labor force that he doesn't really want to leave very bad. So Moses has to invoke the 10 plagues, you know, the hailstorm, the frogs, the, what others? Locusts, yeah, that's a good one. Locusts, and the river turning to blood, you know. All that good Old Testament stuff is what Moses brings down on Pharaoh. And eventually Pharaoh acquiesces and said, okay, fine. You all get out of here. He lets the people go. But then he has some second thoughts. He regrets his decision. He regrets letting his free labor force go. So he and his 600 plus chariots go cruising after him into the desert, chasing the fleeing former slaves down. When the fleeing slaves, newly freed slaves, realize that Pharaoh is chasing them down, things get a little tense. They get a little snarky even with Moses, you might say. The people ask Moses what in the world was he thinking of when he led them out of relative safety in Egypt. And of course, slavery is never a good thing per se, but it was a relatively known thing and reasonable safety in that. They more than asked about what he was thinking. They ranted at Moses in loud voices, letting him know how unhappy they were as he led them into the desert. Is this not the very thing that we told you in Egypt? Let us alone and let us serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. They are seriously not amused at having their back against a wall, more particularly a wall of water 1,500 feet high. I looked it up. That's the average depth. The deepest parts are 5,000 feet. That's a deep thing. The movie makes it look like a lake that they're going through, but the reality is somewhat different. They have their back up against the wall. Pharaoh's bearing down on them, intending to do each of them great harm. It is often thought that the Lord used Moses to part the sea, and everybody traipsed through the channel, keeping their feet dry as they cruised across. I don't know that it's quite that simple. It leaves us believing in a Disneyland God that just does everything to make our lives easier. And thank you very much. I don't think it was that simple. I grew up on a farm irrigating corn in the summers, and we didn't have any of those fancy things that they call center pivots or gated pipe. We used siphon tubes out of an irrigation ditch. Twice a day, all summer long, going out to irrigate the corn. One thing that I remember from that is even when you took the water away, it was muddy and messy for a long time. I know the text says that it was on dry ground, and I'm not going to say that the God that can part a 1,500-foot channel in the Red Sea can't make the ground dry if he wants. It just seemed like that's wrapped up a little too neatly. It seems like there should be more difficulty involved. So I think when God answers prayers, it doesn't always make everything easy. I think when God answers prayers, it doesn't mean that we don't have some work to do. However they got there, the newly freed people reached the other side with Pharaoh's army hot on their trail. You'd think that they would wheel around and attempt some sort of defense, but I guess I don't know if they had any weapons. I'm thinking they're pretty well overwhelmed by these 600 chariots bearing down on them, attempting to thrash them, man, woman, and child. They just can't stand idly by, right? Well, interestingly enough, that's exactly what Moses suggests. But Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid, stand firm, and see the deliverance that the Lord will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to keep still." Stand firm, keep still, as if God has things covered. What kind of nonsense is that? 600 chariots. To be sure, there's a time when we are called to action, when we're called into doing something in response to a situation we find ourselves in. I can think back many years ago when I was walking down the street with my youngest, who was about 3 at the time, and a German Shepherd came running across the street and looked, very menacing, as German Shepherds do at times. And I didn't think about my response. I just charged at the German Shepherd, which could have turned out badly, but fortunately for all of us, the dog ran away. One of those unthinking things. Sometimes you just have to respond to what's going on. Standing firm and being still would not have been the appropriate response for me, and certainly not for my daughter at that situation. Still, I wonder if there aren't more times we need to stand firm while at the same time being still before we charge into the fray. We do have a responsibility to protect the oppressed, but putting ourselves into the middle of every fight we run across is not necessary, and in fact usually causes more harm than good. When I can think back to a certain time in my life as a much younger man, and in certain venues, shall we say, where jumping into the fray in the defense of someone who didn't need defending, much less one defending, was the machismo kind of thing to do, and so that's how we act. I don't think we added to the situation. In fact, I think we generally made it worse. And not to mention that in much of the political discourse in our society right now, it would be better if people didn't lean on their political and particularly their religious certainties to start a fight every time something comes up, to join into every discussion. For whatever reason, we have a tendency to be drawn into these kind of things, and I think Moses knew something many thousands of years ago, that sometimes standing firm and being still go together quite nicely. We have a tendency to think that we're in control. And sometimes that's fine. We need to take responsibility for the things that we say, the things that we do. The reality is, and this is the point that Moses is making, in the grand scheme of things, it is God who is in control. It is God who is in charge of things. It is God that has it covered. And we need to get out of the way. It's a fair point with the newly freed slaves. I mean, what exactly were they going to accomplish standing up to Pharaoh and his 600 plus chariots bearing down on them? That'd be like a daycare standing up to a battalion of armored vehicles. It's not going to handle it. Instead, they let God be in control, and God took care of them. God saved them. God has it covered. It's a fair point with our sin as well. I mean, what exactly are we going to accomplish standing up against our sin? I tried to think of a clever example of what that would be like, but metaphors and allegories and all that kind of fell apart when I'm trying to think of something that would be like, because it's incomprehensible, the idea that we could take care of our own sin. Imagine trying to keep track of every sinful thought, word, and deed in your week. Luther attempted that, and it almost drove him to madness. His confessors told him to lighten up. It's pretty well impossible for us to do that, but it is not impossible for God. Like the Hebrews with their back up against the wall of water, we can let God be in control so that God can save us. Save us through Christ's sacrifice on the cross. God has it covered. Thanks be to God. Amen. Would you please stand and continue worship in song?